Most men don't realize this. Attraction doesn't usually disappear because of looks, timing, or even competition. It disappears in something much quieter: predictability. The moment she can already finish your sentence in her head, her attention starts to leave the conversation long before she physically leaves the chat. And here's the uncomfortable truth. She didn't lose interest because you said the wrong thing. She lost interest because she already knew what you were going to say next. So the real question is, when she talks to you right now, is she discovering you or just confirming you? In the next few minutes, you're going to understand a pattern most men never see. Why conversations start strong, but slowly lose emotional charge. Why a woman who is engaged, curious, even excited, suddenly becomes distant or busy. And most importantly, how to shift your communication so you stay mentally stimulating instead of emotionally forgettable. We're going to break this down using real principles from cognitive psychology, attention theory, and how the brain processes novelty and reward in social interaction. Because attraction isn't just emotional, it's neurological. And once you understand how attention actually works in conversation, you stop guessing what went wrong and start controlling what happens next. Think about a conversation where everything goes exactly as expected. She asks a question, you give a safe answer, she responds politely, and the loop continues. At first, it feels smooth, comfortable, even nice. But inside her brain, something very different is happening. Dopamine, the chemical linked to curiosity and engagement, spikes when something is slightly uncertain or novel, not chaotic, just unpredictable enough to require attention. When your responses become too clean, too safe, too rehearsed, the brain stops treating the interaction as rewarding. It becomes background noise. So even if she's still replying, mentally she's no longer leaning in. The practical shift here is subtle but powerful. Instead of answering in straight lines, you add depth, contrast, or unexpected framing, not to be confusing, but to be mentally alive. Because the goal isn't to impress her, it's to keep her brain engaged in discovery, and once you understand that, you stop aiming for perfect answers and start aiming for alive conversations, which leads directly into the next layer. There's a stage in almost every interaction where you become comfortable with each other. And many men confuse comfort with connection. But comfort without depth is actually the beginning of disengagement. Imagine a woman who initially found you interesting. You had energy, curiosity, a bit of unpredictability in your tone, but over time, your responses become routines. You talk about the same topics. You give predictable reactions. You stop evolving in the conversation. Now she feels like she's talking to a version of you she already fully understands. And the human brain does something interesting here. Once it believes it has mapped someone completely, it stops allocating attention to them. Psychologists call this cognitive closure. The mind prefers finished patterns over open-ended ones. So what keeps attraction alive isn't just comfort, it's the sense that there is still more to discover. Practically, this means you should occasionally break your own conversational pattern, shift tone, introduce perspective, ask questions that don't have obvious answers, not to play games, but to stay psychologically unfinished. Because unfinished always feels more alive than fully known, and that's where interest survives. Now let's go deeper. There's a moment in conversation where you feel the urge to clarify everything, to make sure she understands you correctly, to fill every gap, to avoid misunderstanding. But here's the paradox. The more fully you explain yourself, the less she feels invited to explore you. Picture this scenario. She asks you something simple, and instead of answering directly, you expand into a long explanation, covering every angle, every detail, every justification. Logically, it makes sense, but psychologically, it removes tension. And tension is what creates curiosity. In communication theory, interest often lives in the space between what is said and what is left unsaid. When you overfill that space, there's nothing left for her imagination to engage with. So instead of proving clarity, you accidentally remove intrigue. A more effective approach is controlled restraint. Answer clearly, but not exhaustively. Leave room for interpretation. Let your words breathe, because when her mind has to participate in understanding you, she becomes more invested in you. And investment is what turns attention into attachment. Now here's where things get even more important. Let's say she teases you, or disagrees with you, or says something slightly unexpected. Most men respond in the same emotional lane every time. Either they get defensive, overly agreeable, or try to smooth everything out immediately. Over time, this creates emotional predictability. And predictability doesn't feel safe in an attractive way. It feels flat. Now imagine instead that your emotional responses have range. Sometimes you lean into humor, sometimes you pause, sometimes you challenge lightly, sometimes you simply observe. What changes is not your personality, it's your emotional variability. Human attention is naturally drawn to patterns that are not fully stable, but not chaotic either. That's what creates engagement. Think of it like music. A single repeated note becomes noise. Variation becomes rhythm. So, if your emotional responses are always identical, she stops reading you actively. And once she stops reading you, she stops being interested in you. The goal is not emotional unpredictability in a chaotic sense. It's controlled variation. You remain grounded, but not mechanically consistent. And that difference is everything, which brings us to a critical turning point. Here's something most people never consider. A woman doesn't usually lose interest in a single moment. It happens in micro decisions, tiny internal moments where she goes, I already know what he's going to say. And each of those moments quietly lowers emotional investment. Now ask yourself something honestly. If she screenshotted your last 5 conversations, would they look like 5 different mental experiences? Or just the same emotional pattern repeated with different topics? Because that answer explains more about attraction loss than anything else. Let's continue. There is a version of communication that many men adopt because it feels socially correct, agreeable, predictable, easy to respond to. At first, it feels like it's working. She replies. She engages. There's no conflict. But underneath that surface, something important is missing. Psychological friction. Friction is not conflict. It's not negativity. It's contrast. It's the difference between what is expected and what actually happens in the interaction. Without friction, everything becomes emotionally smooth. And emotionally smooth quickly becomes emotionally invisible. A conversation without contrast doesn't give the brain anything to latch onto. So the safe man approach often leads to slow disengagement, not because anything went wrong, but because nothing stood out. The shift here is simple. Don't optimize for safety and communication. Optimize for presence. Say what is real, not just what is agreeable. Hold your tone. Express perspective without over-validating every moment, because presence creates imprint. Safety without presence creates forgettability. And now we move into the final layer of understanding. Here's a truth most people miss. She is not just listening to your words. She is tracking your mental movement. Is your thinking dynamic? Does your perspective evolve as the conversation progresses? Do you reveal layers over time? Or is everything already fully packaged in the first few exchanges? When there is mental movement, the conversation feels alive. When there is none, it feels like repetition. This is why some conversations feel like they flow, even when the topic is simple, and others feel dead, even when the topic is interesting. It's not the topic, it's the evolution inside the conversation. So the real skill is not being interesting in a static way, it's being interesting in motion. Let your thoughts develop as you speak. Don't present yourself like a finished product. Present yourself like a process. Because people don't stay engaged with what is already complete. They stay engaged with what is still becoming. And that naturally leads us to something deeper. At the core of all of this, it was never really about conversation techniques. It's about what happens when someone feels they've already fully figured you out. Because once a person believes there is nothing left to discover, they don't just lose curiosity. they lose emotional investment. And that can feel personal, but it isn't always about your worth. It's about human psychology. The mind is built to seek patterns, not preserve them. So the moment you become fully predictable, you stop activating that part of her attention that feels alive. But here's the deeper truth most men miss. You don't need to become someone else to fix this. You just need to stop reducing yourself into something easy to categorize. Because when you stay mentally layered, when your communication has depth, contrast, and evolution, you naturally create space for continued interest. Not because you're trying to keep her hooked, but because you're no longer giving a finished version of yourself in the first 5 minutes. And that changes everything. If this resonated with you, it probably means you've seen this pattern before, where things start strong, then slowly fade without a clear reason. The question to reflect on is simple. In your recent conversations, are you creating discovery or just repetition? I'd genuinely like to know your answer in the comments. And if you want, the next video will go even deeper into a related pattern, why emotional excitement fades even when attraction is still present, and how timing in conversation changes everything. Because sometimes it's not what you say that matters most. It's whether she still feels like she's discovering you. And once that feeling is gone, attention rarely stays behind.